Okay, everyone, welcome to the Advanced Endocrinology lecture. So I think this title is a little presumptuous, honestly. I'm pretty sure this is just basic endocrinology, to be honest with you. Like if you guys were to take the 500 level class endocrinology, then yeah, that'd be advanced endocrinology. So don't be scared by this. Like I feel like a lot of these hormones that we're about to talk about, you already know a lot about. So that's like the first study objective I have for you guys. It's going to be take a chill pill. Most of this information you've briefly heard. So I don't know if you guys remember, but there is a slide at the very beginning of class in the midterm one material where it just listed out all these different hormones. And Dr. Busey said by the end of the class, you should be able to recognize all these. Either after this video or before you actually watch this video, I challenge you to go back and find that slide. It was in like endocrine section, I'm thinking. I'm not sure, but go test yourself. See what you do know, see what you don't know, see if you have learned these hormones. Because I feel like today is more or less just a review of hormone pathways. So really our only objective here is to find where the major hormones in the body are derived from, right? So there's so many other hormones you guys need to realize we're not really covering. And if you take endocrinology, then you actually would cover all these hormones. This is kind of an intro into that class, right? So where they're going, so what is their target tissue? What are they trying to do? And what action or like what physiological response do they produce? So this is the structure of this lecture. I want you guys to understand what we're doing. So not everything's really going to tie together very well. We just have to cover these different systems. So first we're going to go over the adrenal glands, and what I would take out of the adrenal glands is corticosteroids, where they're made, like what signals for their release. You need to know all about like the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary hormones um, that help, not help, but signal for the release of corticosteroids. Next, we would do the thyroid glands. Um, and specifically the hormones that are coming out of the thyroid. Know that that's in charge of metabolism in your body, like how hot you are, how cold you are, like you can eat more, stuff like that. They can have a role in that. And then growth hormone is primarily known for bone regulation, but it can like, obviously it's not just bone, but the growth hormones, like there's like a whole class, like we learned about insulin like growth hormone, and that has a specific role. Today we're just talking about what is known as growth hormone, and that's more specific to bone like length, but just know that growth hormones obviously will help grow internal organs as well, like help your liver expand in size, and if you have pathology with those, you're gonna also have issues. And the last one to know is the parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone, oh, and calcitonin, we'll talk about those kind of synonymously because they are antagonistic to one another, meaning that they have the exact opposite effect. And that just serves to regulate calcium concentration in the blood. Um, what was I going to say? One more thing that I wanted to mention is that I didn't put on here that you could add to this list is for most of these, know the major pathologies. So yeah, like if these systems get screwed up, how are you gonna, as a clinician, be able to see that in your patients? Okay, so that's starting with the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland, excuse me, sits right on top of the kidney. We know that it's like the kidney's little hat that it wears around town. And then it has a medulla and a cortex, pretty much like any organ. But in the adrenal gland, it's so important to realize that there is a major difference between the cortex and the medulla. So in the medulla, you get secretion of catecholamines, which we don't talk about for the rest of this lecture, but I hope you guys know what the catecholamines are because you are tested on them in other sections. So the main catecholamines you need to know are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that comes in from the medulla, okay, of the adrenal cortex. So I would know that for sure. Now, what we're going to talk about mostly today is what's going on here in the cortex. And it's secreting steroids. And I want you to know, like, when you see the word steroid, you think, okay, well, yeah, Jack dude's in the gym, like Morgan's working out. He's obviously using steroids. But I also want you guys to think of like um, any molecule that is derived from cholesterol. For like my understanding, and I've been taught this in every class, a steroid hormone is just a hormone derived from cholesterol. I'm pretty sure that's like the defining characteristic. So this could be replaced with adrenal cortex secretes cortisol derived hormones, and we just shorten that to steroids, so you guys are aware of that. Okay, and this is just a good chart. So there's not just like one big adrenal cortex, like there's actually different cell layers. So the zona glomerulosa is the most like apical, right? Because this is like flipped. So if you see like this is the capsule, that means it's the outside. And if you look back at the image we're coming from, you're looking more at the outside on this side of the slide. And this is the very interior or the medulla. So it just kind of flipped from what you would expect. But yeah, you have the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, the reticularis, and you're not tested on like where they are relative to one another, um, and not necessarily like what they produce, but I'd be familiar with it. So glomerulosa is aldosterone. We already know what aldosterone does. We've talked about that in previous lectures. It's the kidney hormone. It's not the one that does stuff with dehydration, but it does help conserve water. So the primary hormone I would know for like dehydration in the kidney is vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. And I'm bringing that back up because I just saw that it's a question and we'll see on the test. So if anyone's actually paying attention, then we'll see if you guys get that right because I thought that was a very hard question. Um, and then the zona fasciculata is where the glucocorticoids are released. And there's quite a few of these, but the main one we're really going to talk about today is cortisol from the zona fasciculata. And then you have the sex hormones like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, DHEA, DHT, all those nonsense. Okay, so that's the basic rundown of the adrenal. I'd be familiar with cortex versus medulla. Cortex has multiple sections in it. You get different hormones from there, and the medulla is giving you catecholamines, which are not sex hormones, obviously, which are not steroid hormones. Something completely different. All of these are steroid hormones, okay? So cortisol, let's talk about it. This is such an important hormone in your body. And I feel like it doesn't get as much credit as it does. And I know after the metabolism lecture, you guys are like, Morgan, you're crazy. You just like love this stuff too much. But like having cortisol regulation issues can make someone gain weight no matter how great they are at dieting, no matter how great they are at exercising, they won't be able to sleep well. Like cortisol just does so much in our body. But for this class, as all you really need to know cortisol does is it manages glucose concentrations in the blood. So you can think of it being kind of synonymous to glucagon, but it's not directly signaled like with insulin and glucagon, you know, in the alpha and the beta cells right in the pancreas, right? This is another mechanism to get glucose into the blood. So if you have high cortisol levels, if you like have a patient come in with high cortisol levels, you're thinking, oh shoot, you probably also have high blood glucose levels. But there's a chance you're not diabetic if your like insulin is still technically working correctly. But the cortisol itself, like we usually just say, oh, cortisol is just used for um, monitoring glucose levels, but that's not true. If you guys want to pause and look over at this chart, this is a chart of cortisol, right? So where it's made from, what it's doing. And so what we need to know is it's going to increase blood glucose, but it does more than that too. And if you guys are so interested, let me know, or let one of the nutrition professors know that you love this stuff. So what's happening here is you do need to know this. This is called the uh, H APH access. Oh, I'm going to get that wrong. So don't quote me on it. I'm sure Dr. B will say it in his lecture. But there's this very specific name for this pathway of hormones, and it's something something access. You guys probably know it. I forgot it off the top of my head. But you have CRH, and that comes up from the hypothalamus, releases ACTH in the anterior pituitary, and that releases cortisol. And this is a long loop negative feedback because these cortisol is in another part of the body. So we talked about like long versus short. So cortisol comes back to the cells that release ACTH and to the cells that release CRH, and it says, please stop. You're going to kill us if you keep going. Okay, so then what does cortisol do? It actually suppresses the immune system. That's not good, right? It goes to the liver and says, gluconeogenesis, give me more glucose, give me more glucose. Goes to the muscle and says, break down your amino acid, break down your proteins, give me amino acids. I can use that for gluconeogenesis. And this is what's kind of interesting that throws people for a loop. So in the interim, like meaning in the short time period, if you have like high cortisol levels, you'll actually get like lipolysis, which is the breaking down of fat. And so like in the next slide, we learn about Cushing's syndrome, which is like where you have really high levels of cortisol. And usually a telltale sign of, not like every obese patient has Cushing's syndrome, but if you like are thinking someone's going to have Cushing syndrome, there's a pretty good chance that they are going to also suffer from obesity as well. So people are like, well, if you're breaking down your fats, how in the world are you becoming obese? And this actually changes over time. So this is like in the short term, if cortisol is released, you get a breakdown of fats. And actually, what happens in the long term, if you guys can see this, um, you actually have a very high increase of visceral fat, which is like the unhealthy fat. And people with Cushing syndrome can actually have like decently skinny arms and skinny legs and kind of look like misbalanced in that way. So what Cushing's is doing is breaking down fats in the like in the extremities, but it's not breaking down fats in the gut, and that's really unhealthy. So high levels of cortisol can kill you pretty good, pretty sufficiently. Yeah, it's kind of scary. So, and then this, what you need to know from here is it's something important called like a diurnal production or secretion, blah, blah, blah. You need to know that for biochem, not for this class, but just be familiar with cortisol levels are regulated throughout the day. And usually you get like a really high spike. Uh, I don't agree with this chart. Well, if this is 8 o'clock, then that could be true. So usually your highest spike of cortisol is right before you wake up in the morning. So that means if you think about it, like high cortisol, that means high blood glucose. It's trying to get you up in the morning. So maybe some of you who aren't morning people suffer from not having this huge spike of cortisol and you need to see a doctor. Just kidding. I'm sure you have other reasons for being tired in the morning. Okay, so this is the synthesis. So this slide is like we said in early, you need to know where the hormone comes from, right? And so we know this pathway. So that's one, like what it's signaled for to release, what it does, right? So increases glucose in the blood. And then also what you need to know is kind of the basics of this hormone. I don't know if I left that in the study objectives, but this is all we're saying here is it's a cholesterol-based hormone, right? So cortisol is derived from cholesterol. And you just see all these empty spaces. These are like inactive intermediates that aren't really doing anything. So cholesterol goes to this, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you biochem majors could tell me exactly what this is or what this is or what this is. I don't know. I don't need to know for this class, and I'm sorry about that. I just don't know. But what I do think is really cool that I would take away from here is we like testosterone, right? You think primarily of males when you think of testosterone, and estradiol or estrogen, you think primarily females. But I want you guys to know that these are found in both sexes. It's just there's a lot more testosterone in males, and there's not as much testosterone in females. But if females have like really low testosterone levels, um, that can cause pathologies in the female as well. Like if it gets extremely low, like it can decrease libido and do a bunch of other things. You can look that up if you're more interested in it. But I think what's cool is it's like one step away. Like these are so similar. And progesterone is like 1, 2, 3 steps away from testosterone. So just know that all of these steroid hormones that are released from the adrenal are very related to each other, all derived from cholesterol. So if none of that made sense, the one thing you take from this slide, cortisol derived from cholesterol, steroid hormone. Okay, that would be in your notes somewhere. You need to know that. And I guess why are we like so adamant that you guys know what a steroid hormone is versus peptide? Well, it really like the basis of like how this hormone is derived really tells us how it's going to act in the tissues. So if it's a steroid hormone, it's going to just go straight through the plasma membrane, find a nuclear receptor, and then go ahead and start transcription, usually acting as the transcription factor itself, which is so cool. So that's kind of why you need to know the difference between steroids and peptides. We've already gone over this. Cushing's, you can see like really rosy cheeks, stretch marks, obesity, hump back. You can have like a hump right here on the back of the neck. And Cushing syndrome is just caused by like a really high levels of cortisol. Let's see if there's one more slide on this. No. But what would happen, sorry, I'm jumping around. But if there's really high levels of cortisol, there's a couple things that could go wrong, right? So you could have a tumor in the pituitary gland that doesn't respond to high levels of cortisol. So you keep getting ACTH release. And even though this negative feedback loop is there, it's not being able to respond. You could also have it in the hypothalamus, right? Maybe a tumor up here, or you could just straight up have like a tumor on the adrenals. And even if there's like virtually no ACTH or CRH in the blood, it's still releasing cortisol because it's just going and going and going. So that's how you get Cushing's. It's usually a tumor related disease that is hopefully treatable. It can also happen off in the periphery, like, and those are kind of harder to diagnose. And if you guys take the same biochem class I did, you learn more about how to diagnose Cushing syndrome and Cushing's disease, which are two, which have similar presentations but different pathologies associated with them. Okay, so I hope you guys don't think I'm the stupidest person in the world, but I have no idea what co-synthesis means. So if you guys know, great. Shoot me a message in the chat on Monday, like, Morgan, you idiot, co-synthesis is blah, blah, blah. I have no idea, but what I can teach you, what's interesting from this slide, is pigmentation Addison's disease. So we talked about Cushing's in the last one. Addison's disease is just another pathology associated with um, like the axis I was trying to teach you, the CRH, ACTH, cortisol. Um, Addison's similar, and what happens here is you have this POMC, the pro-opiomelanocortin, is like this multi-protein subunit, so you can see that by these different colors. It gets broken down into different things, and those get broken down to go do their things, right? Like the body's complicated. That's hopefully what you're understanding from here. But what's kind of interesting is ACTH can be broken down into melanocyte stimulating hormone, specifically the alpha. You don't know that, it doesn't matter. But melanocyte stimulating hormone releases melanin. You have an immune response to decreased food intake. So this causes like pigmentation, right? So you think melanin, like that's the thing in your skin that gives you like your skin color, like how dark it is. And ACTH is actually very similar and can be broken down into MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, so we're on to the thyroid. So hopefully you guys understand cortisol, you understand where it's coming from, the cortex of the adrenal cortex versus the adrenal medulla. You understand that axis where it's like ACTH, CRH, ACTH, cortisol, understand the negative feedback there and all that nonsense. And of course, what cortisol does. So now we're moving on to the thyroid gland. I think the thyroid's a little bit simpler, honestly. But there is something I want to point out to you on this slide. So you have the follicular cells and then the colloid, which is a glycoprotein. So you can kind of think of the colloid as being just like extracellular matrix, kind of. So glycoprotein, hopefully you guys realize that just means like glycosylated protein or protein with a bunch of sugars on it. So a lot of our extracellular matrix is like glycosylated proteins. But what happens here is you have the follicular cells, and we'll get into that in the next slide, and they pump intermediates in of what are going to be the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, and they get pumped back out. But you guys also need to know C cells are here in the thyroid gland. This is very important later on in the lecture for calcitonin release when we talk about parathyroid hormone and calcium. So this is thyroxine synthesis, and thyroxine is pretty much just like your T3 and your T4. So I would be familiar with this, and I would definitely know that T3 and T4 are amino acid based hormones, and they're based off tyrosine specifically. So I would know that because they have to act as, like, when T3 and T4 are released, they're going to go act as like bind a receptor on the surface because they cannot just blast their way through the membrane. But what's really cool is iodine is actually straight up incorporated into these hormones, if you can see that there, which I think is different than a lot of hormones. That's kind of cool. So let's go through it. So iodine, like we just said, based off this image, iodine is vital for proper T3 and T4 recognition and function in the body, right? Because structure begets function. So what happens, I'm going to start here, but know that something's going on here. So iodine gets in through a symporter with sodium. And then iodine also gets pumped across the membrane out here into the colloid matter, into that extracellular matrix. So iodine's here. Now what's happening is the follicular cells, specifically in the thyroid, can make what's called thyroglobulin, which is just like this multi-structured protein. What happens is thyroglobulin comes out into the extracellular matrix too. Iodine is incorporated or put onto these aromatic groups, okay? Either 4 of them for T4 or 3 of them for T3. And then as you can see, like on this one thyroglobulin, you have like T3, T4, T4. So each of these lines can like be a T3 or a T4, because look at this guy, it's like not that big. So really all you need is like a tyrosine residue, meaning like maybe each one of these is just a tyrosine. That's how I like to think about it. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's possible, right? So if you just need tyrosine, it's going to just break off. So anyway, this protein that now has like T3 and T4 tied to it comes back into the follicular cell, broken down, T3 and T4 are released into the bloodstream, and they go on their way and do their job. Okay, so that's pretty simple, right? Iodine comes in, proteins, makes T3, T4, bumps back out. I would know follicular cell and colloid is important in this slide. This is a little too much for me, and I'm sure Dr. B will have like a more in-depth question. If you guys understand the basics of what I just taught you here, then this will also make sense, or like at least you'll understand what's really going on here, okay? You guys understand the basics of it. Don't get all freaked out by this. I feel like it's just another drawing that's a little bit hard to deal with. Okay, so the pathology you need to know with thyroid hormone release, there's a couple of them. So I'm going to start down here, Graves' disease, because I think this is the most interesting. But this is hyperthyroidism, and Graves' disease is actually an immune disorder in which your body produces antibodies against the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor on the thyroid gland, and it actually activates it. So the antibodies don't just like bind it and block it, they actually activate it like constitutively. So you have a really high T3, T4. And you can see like someone who has Graves' syndrome really has these bulging eyeballs, right? Like these are coming out of the eye socket, right? And there's also obviously other issues going on. Like they're probably really hot all the time because their metabolism's going. But Graves' disease, hyperthyroidism. Goiter right here is when you have really low iodine levels and you think, well, iodine, why is that important? Oh yeah, because iodine is vital for T3 and T4. So pretty much if you have iodine deficiency, you don't have salt that has iodine in it, then you're not gonna actually get T3 and T4. And what happens here is then you actually get a swelling of the thyroid gland because your body's signaling like, please release more T3, T4, and there's nothing wrong, except it just can't make it because there's no iodine. So just think of it like making more and more and more and more and more stuff, but it can't get out. Therefore, it's going to grow, it's going to enlarge, get really big, and you have a goiter. Myxedema is hypothyroidism, and that's like very common, honestly. Like I work at a pharmacy, you guys, and I'd say I sell like levothyroxine, which is the manufactured version of T3. Like all the time. Like I'd say at least 10 to 20 prescriptions per day. Super common to have thyroid, hypothyroidism and low thyroid levels. Okay, so this is the release of thyroid hormone. I think it's pretty simple. So you have TRH from the hypothalamus, TSH from the anterior pituitary, goes down to the thyroid, releases T4, T3, or signals for T4, T3, blah, 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 systemic effects, okay? And we just talked about these things. If you guys wanna pause, you can look into them. You're not really super tested on this, so I don't care, but it is interesting to know. Okay, next one, growth hormone. We're halfway through, you guys. So growth hormone, I think more than half. I think cortisol actually took longer than I was expecting. So growth hormone, you have GnRH from the hypothalamus, GH, and GH specifically goes down and acts and does its nonsense, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. I don't really know what else to tell you guys. So like I said before, growth hormone, there are other insulin-like growth factors. So just realize that there's not just like one growth hormone, but specifically what we're focusing on is cartilage growth, which leads to bone growth. And just know that there are feedback loops here, right? Like if you have high insulin, like growth factors, it's going to. And don't get confused here. This is not going to act like insulin at all. It just looks like insulin, like its sequence looks like insulin, does not act like insulin, and except that it is an anabolic hormone like insulin is. So you do have regulation here of GnRH and somatostatin, right? So somatostatin, we also know this from digestive. I'd be very familiar with that. It's always negative feedback. Okay, growth hormone. Wow, that guy's big. So really what you need to know here is we're talking about bone growth. So acromegaly, this term right here, this is excessive bone growth after the growth plates have like fused. So let's look at that real quick. So you have the bone, and right here is what's called the epiphyseal line or the epiphyseal plate. And when you're like a kid up to like the age of, I don't know, like when you stop growing kind of is when these fuse. And what that means is in development, this is all cartilage still, like this line right here and this line right here is all cartilage, and it's surrounded by bone. And so once this fuses, meaning this becomes cartilage, then you're done growing like height wise. So acromegaly you can see here. So this woman, she had a very normal looking phenotype. And when she was younger and as she gets older, she actually had acromegaly, which is an excess of growth hormone after your growth plates have fused, right? So what happens is if the bones are being told to grow and they're like, I cannot physically grow any longer, I have no cartilage left. Well, what they actually end up doing is thickening, right? So they get real thick. You can see like the thickness in the jawline here. So very normal phenotype at a younger age, acromegaly. So she's not necessarily going to be super tall or anything, but just very, very thick bones. Whereas this guy, you could actually say, well, he looks like he actually just has giantism, I'm pretty sure is what it's called. And that's just acromegaly before the growth plates fuse. So you're just getting this crazy, crazy growth. And people who have this, if it's not treated, they can then get acromegaly after um, after the plates fuse and then get really thick bones too. So this is bone length. You guys can look at this. It's really interesting how bones formed and whatnot, but not super important here. Just know that sex hormones are permissive and T3 is as well. And permissivity of hormones means like if there was a receptor here, there could be a receptor here for say like testosterone. And testosterone binds, but it doesn't do anything. All it does is prepare this tissue for growth hormone. And so it helps growth hormone in its effects and what it's going to try and do. Okay, we're on to our last little bit. You guys, you've done so good. So now we need to talk about parathyroid hormone and calcium levels. So parathyroid are these little beans on the posterior side, so the back side of your thyroid gland, and they just sit there and they release parathyroid hormones. That one's at least pretty easy, right? PTH, parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone, what it's doing is just trying to increase blood calcium levels because that ion is vital for survival. Like if that ion gets messed up in your blood, you're gonna die real quick, real hard, real fast. So parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels. And hopefully you guys remember from calcitonin in the C cells, calcitonin is released from the thyroid. So this gland, right, the actual thyroid, not the parathyroid. Calcitonin is released from the thyroid and that decreases blood calcium. Now remember that it says calcitonin, like the end of it is IN as in. So I think, okay, calcium going into the tissues, going into the bone. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So what it does is increases vitamin D synthesis, increases renal reabsorption of calcium, meaning like if it was going to be excreted, now it's going to stay in the blood, and increases bone resorption, which is like actually the breaking down of bone is resorption. Okay. So why is calcium so important? You guys can read over this, but what I learned while studying for this lecture that's really cool is this portion. So it actually binds to like the polar head groups and prevents other ions from being able to like just go through their voltage gated channel. So it helps maintain like a really stable Nernst potential on that cell. So without like proper levels of calcium, you can have hyperexcitability, and anytime you think hyperexcitability in neurons, you can think of seizures. I can't talk. But obviously, it's very important in bone. And our body, like, we know our bones are really important. If we didn't have bones, that would die. Our body more looks at bones as reservoirs of calcium. So if you don't have enough calcium in your diet, your body is totally fine to raid your bones, even if it's going to be detrimental to you, because you can live with no bones. Well, I don't know. That's not like true, right? You die if you had no bones. But if your bones are really weak, you can still survive. But if your blood calcium levels are screwed up, you aren't going to survive. So your body's prioritizing the blood calcium over the bones. So that's what we're looking at here in osteoporosis. So normal bone, you can see there's this whole matrix of like soft bone in the middle, and you guys don't need to know like all the bone structures. But in osteoporosis, there's big holes. What you should know though is osteoclasts versus osteoblasts. Osteoclasts are under the direction of PTH, parathyroid hormone, and they secrete enzymes that break up the bone. So these are just little cells. They look like octopi, right? Like with way more than just 8 legs, but they just break down the bone and release calcium back into the blood. And osteoblasts are the cells that actually kind of make up the bone. They're they're just like out here in the bone and they secreted all this extracellular matrix that makes the bone. So osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts break down bone. You can think clast, catabolic, blast, building. I don't know, that's how I like to think about it sometimes. So PTH and calcitonin will obviously shut this down because calcitonin is trying to get calcium into the blood. Vitamin D is also very important with regulating calcium levels. It actually helps calcium be absorbed better. So if you have very low vitamin D, but you're having a lot of calcium, maybe the calcium can't get into your body. And this slide's kind of cool. So dietary calcium coming in from your diet, it's going to come into the extracellular food, and you want to keep it at 2.5 millimolar. And your body's going to do everything it can to do that. So if it's too high, you're going to get calcitonin release. It's going to be put in bone. If it's too low, you get PTH, and it comes back out. PTH will also bring it back in from the kidneys, and cells can take a little bit of it, but not very much, right? So you should know bone, kidney is the main thing that's going on here. And guys, we are done. You did so well. I hope that lecture made sense. It is a lot to know, but hopefully you guys understand the basic mechanisms and all that good nonsense. So I hope you have a great day, and I will see you on Monday.